When you pull back emotionally, you create a space that many people, especially men, are not used to experiencing in a relationship. That space, that absence of your constant emotional availability, becomes the very thing that starts to generate curiosity, concern, and even a renewed sense of desire. Because what often happens in relationships, particularly when feelings start to develop, is that one person begins to lean in more heavily. They start to give more, invest more emotionally, show more interest, ask more questions, offer more reassurance, and in doing so, without realizing it, they disrupt the balance of energy. One person is pouring in while the other becomes more passive, more withdrawn, or even begins to take that emotional investment for granted. Emotional distance isn't about shutting off or becoming cold, it's about stepping back just enough to rebalance the dynamic. When you're too readily available emotionally, when your mood is dictated by his actions, when you're always ready to talk things through, explain yourself, reassure him, or smooth things over, you actually send a message, even if unintentionally, that you have more to lose than he does. That your emotional well-being is deeply tied to how he feels about you or whether he responds to you in the way you want him to. This emotional dependence is not attractive. It creates a sense of predictability, and with predictability comes a kind of emotional complacency on his end. The truth is, people don't value what they think they can always have. Emotional overinvestment communicates that you're already all in, regardless of how he's showing up. It removes the need for him to reflect, to wonder, to question whether he's matching your effort or if he's losing something of real worth. But the moment you start to pull back, not out of spite or manipulation, but from a grounded sense of self-respect and clarity, that's when things start to shift. He begins to notice that something is different. Maybe you're not responding as quickly. Maybe your tone is calmer, less eager, more detached. You're no longer sharing every detail of your day or asking about his. You're not seeking closeness in the way you were before. And it's that shift in your emotional presence that becomes noticeable. Even if he doesn't mention it right away, it registers. It triggers something. Not panic, not necessarily even confusion at first, but an awareness. A new weight to your absence. Your emotional pull is no longer something he can rely on without effort. That reliability, that cushion of knowing you'd always be there emotionally, it's gone. And in that space, a man often finds himself asking, what changed? This is the moment when value is restored. When your emotional energy stops flowing so freely in his direction, it begins to flow back into yourself. You start focusing on your peace, your passions, your purpose. You're no longer emotionally orbiting around him, and that independence makes you magnetic again. Because now you're not reaching out to get a reaction. You're not trying to control the outcome. You're simply being selective with where your emotional energy goes. And that decision creates contrast. Contrast between how things were before, when you were always emotionally tuned in, and how they are now. That contrast is powerful. It reintroduces a sense of uncertainty into the dynamic. Not in a manipulative way, but in a way that causes him to recalibrate how he sees you. Suddenly, the effort he thought he didn't need to make starts to feel necessary. The attention he used to receive so easily isn't showing up anymore. The emotional safety net he always had with you is no longer guaranteed. He begins to chase, not because you're playing hard to get, but because you're no longer giving away the emotional benefits of a relationship without seeing a real commitment or consistent effort from him. This isn't about being heartless or shutting down. It's about reclaiming your center. It's about understanding that your emotions are precious and should be reserved for someone who is investing in you with the same depth and consistency. When you pull back emotionally, you're not punishing him. You're respecting yourself. And in doing that, you naturally create a space where he has to decide whether he values what he's losing enough to step forward and meet you where you are. There's something incredibly powerful about a woman who knows who she is and what she wants, but doesn't feel the need to put it all out there immediately. That balance of certainty mixed with a sense of mystery is what draws someone in and keeps them curious. When you're too emotionally open too soon, when you lay all your cards on the table without really seeing how the other person is playing theirs, it removes the tension that keeps a connection alive. Men are naturally wired to be curious. to pursue what feels just out of reach, to uncover what's hidden beneath the surface. And when that mystery is gone, when everything is already given, there's nothing left to explore. You can be the most loving, sincere, emotionally deep person in the world, but if you give too much too early, especially before he's demonstrated consistency, effort, and presence, you remove the very thing that makes emotional intimacy meaningful. It's not that you should withhold love or pretend to be someone you're not. It's about understanding that someone shouldn't get access to the deepest parts of you just because they showed up. That kind of access should be earned gradually, not offered up front in the hopes that it will create security. Certainty is magnetic. When you know what you want, what you deserve, and you're not afraid to walk away from anything that doesn't meet that standard, people can feel it. That kind of energy isn't loud. It doesn't beg for attention. It doesn't try to impress. It simply exists, quietly and confidently. But here's the part that makes it even more compelling. When your certainty doesn't come with emotional overexposure, when you're calm, kind, and open, yet there's still a layer of you that someone has to work to uncover. That mystery, that intentional choice to not emotionally unload everything, is not about playing games. It's about maintaining self-respect. A man feels most drawn to a woman when he senses she is grounded in herself, yet he can't quite figure her out. She's not distant, but she's not rushing. She's not cold, but she's not oversharing. She's responsive, but she's not always available. That unpredictability, that space she creates, becomes a place where he leans in more. He starts paying attention. He begins to wonder what she's thinking, what makes her tick, what she really feels. He starts to study her, not because she's being difficult, but because she hasn't made it easy to assume he knows her already. When someone becomes emotionally predictable, the mystery fades. And when the mystery fades, so does the need to explore, to chase, to go deeper. Emotional availability is beautiful, but it should be proportionate to the level of effort and consistency someone is showing. Too often, people give the entire emotional experience of a relationship to someone who hasn't even earned it yet. That's when interest starts to dwindle. Not because the emotions were too strong, but because they were too easy to access. There was no journey, no gradual reveal, no intrigue. There's a difference between being open-hearted and being emotionally exposed. One invites connection at a healthy pace, the other risks giving away your power before you even know who you're dealing with. When you lead with mystery, not in a manipulative way, but as a reflection of your own self-worth, you create a container where someone has to rise to meet your energy. They have to prove through time, through actions, and through effort that they deserve to be close to you. That process of earning access deepens their investment because people value what they work for, and they commit more deeply to what feels rare, what feels meaningful, what feels earned. Certainty, when wrapped in mystery, is what keeps someone engaged. It's what keeps them guessing, wondering, wanting to know more. It's what makes them come closer, not because you chase them, but because your energy, your presence, your boundaries created a gravitational pull that made them want to know the version of you that not everyone gets to see. The version of you that's been reserved for someone who genuinely chooses to show up again and again, not because he has to, but because he wants to. When someone receives your attention, your praise, your emotional availability, and your consistent effort without having to do much in return, the impact of that validation starts to weaken. It's not because your feelings aren't genuine, and it's not because you're doing anything wrong by being expressive. The problem is, human nature tends to undervalue what is always available. When validation becomes constant, it stops feeling like a gift and starts feeling like a guarantee. And the moment something feels guaranteed, it loses its significance. The power of your words, your encouragement, and your emotional investment begins to fade, not because they're not meaningful, but because they're no longer rare. In the beginning stages of a relationship, the energy is balanced because both people are trying to figure each other out. There's a natural give and take, an effort to impress, an eagerness to show up. But as soon as one person starts to over-deliver emotionally, constantly reassuring, complimenting, initiating, and giving more than they're receiving, the dynamic shifts. The person on the receiving end starts to feel like they're being emotionally fed without having to lift a finger. And over time, that consistent stream of attention becomes expected rather than appreciated. It's a subtle shift, but a powerful one. What once made him feel special now feels normal. What once made him feel chosen now feels like the default. He no longer stops to think about whether he's earning your attention, he just assumes it's there. And that assumption kills the spark, because what makes love feel real isn't just in the receiving, it's in the mutual exchange. When one side is constantly giving and the other side is passively taking, there's no real connection. There's just a performance of intimacy. Validation should feel earned. It should be a reflection of what someone is bringing to the table. When he shows up consistently, communicates clearly, makes time for you, and treats you with care, your validation becomes a mirror of his own effort. It reinforces his behavior and deepens the bond between you. But when he's distant, vague, inconsistent, and still receiving the same level of emotional energy from you, he has no reason to self-correct. There's no internal alarm going off. He doesn't feel the loss of connection because you've already filled in the gaps for him. This is where restraint becomes powerful. Not as a tactic to manipulate, but as a natural response to protect your emotional currency. When you begin to pull back, not out of fear or punishment, but from a place of clarity, you start to reset the dynamic. You stop giving the benefits of emotional intimacy to someone who's not showing up fully. And in doing that, you reintroduce the idea that your validation is something that has to be earned again. Not because you're withholding, but because you've realized that your attention is valuable. People pay more attention to what they might lose than to what they're guaranteed to keep. When he senses that your energy is no longer flowing toward him freely, he begins to wake up. He starts to wonder why your tone has changed, why your responses are shorter, why you no longer light up when he enters the room. That shift in your emotional engagement becomes noticeable, and it's in that gap between the way things were and the way they are now that desire starts to reawaken. Not just because he misses your affection, but because he begins to question whether he still deserves it. When someone realizes that they can't have your emotional investment by default, they're forced to step up or step aside. If he cares, he'll come closer. He'll start to put in effort. He'll realize that your validation wasn't just flattery, it was a reflection of how you genuinely saw him when he was showing up as his best self. And if he doesn't care, if he pulls back even further, then you have your answer. But either way, your restraint serves you. It filters out those who take without giving and elevates the importance of your emotional presence. The reality is, your validation should feel like a reward, not a routine. It should be something he notices when he's doing the right things, not something he expects no matter how he behaves. When you begin to apply that principle, you shift the power back into your hands. You remind yourself and him that your attention isn't owed. It's earned, and when it's earned, it carries so much more weight. It becomes the very thing that reignites his interest, because suddenly it's no longer guaranteed. It's meaningful again. Every interaction you have with someone teaches them something about how to treat you. It's not just in what you say, it's in what you tolerate, what you overlook, what you chase, and what you emotionally invest in, even when it's not being reciprocated. When you continue giving emotional energy to someone who's inconsistent, vague, or emotionally unavailable, you're silently saying, "This is enough for me." You might not be using those words, but your actions are communicating it loud and clear. And that's where the disconnect happens. Not because you're not worthy of more, but because the standards you've set in practice don't match the standards you believe you have. People pick up on what they can get away with. It doesn't mean they're bad people. It just means we're all conditioned by feedback. If someone sees that you'll stay emotionally connected even when they're giving you breadcrumbs, they won't feel any urgency to do more. If you're always available for the deep conversations, the emotional support, the reassurance, even when they're not investing in the relationship consistently, they will learn that they don't have to do much to get a lot from you. That pattern becomes the rhythm of the connection. One person gives, the other receives. One person hopes for more, the other sees no need to change. Avoiding someone emotionally isn't about playing hard to get. It's about holding a mirror up to the situation and asking yourself, Am I giving more than I'm receiving? If the answer is yes, then it's time to pause, not to punish the other person, but to recalibrate your emotional boundaries. Because the longer you stay in a dynamic where your emotional labor is going unacknowledged or unreturned, the more you reinforce the idea that this is your normal. You start adjusting your expectations downward. You begin rationalizing behavior that should never have been acceptable in the first place. You turn red flags into projects and potential into excuses. But the moment you emotionally pull back, not dramatically, not out of anger, but with quiet confidence, you shift the dynamic. You stop making it so easy for someone to coast. You stop offering the experience of emotional intimacy without requiring effort. You no longer over-explain your feelings or try to convince someone to understand you. Instead, you stand in the power of silence. You start showing, not telling. And in that shift, they feel the difference. Maybe they don't understand it right away. Maybe they even pretend not to notice. But on some level, they feel that something has changed. The energy they were once able to take for granted is no longer there. And that change becomes the turning point, because now they have to make a choice. Either they recognize the value of your presence and rise to meet it, or they continue to drift, revealing to you what they were never capable of giving in the first place. Either way, you win. Because emotional avoidance, when it comes from self-respect, is not a tactic. It's a boundary. It's the recognition that your feelings matter, your time matters, your energy matters. And unless someone is willing to show up for you in a consistent, intentional way, they don't get to experience the emotional depth you bring to the table. It's easy to get caught in the loop of trying to be understood, to explain your standards, to ask someone to show up differently. But over-explaining rarely changes behavior. What changes behavior is consequence. When someone begins to feel the emotional distance you've created, when they no longer feel your presence in the way they used to, that becomes the consequence. That becomes the lesson. Not because you're punishing them, but because you're no longer reinforcing the behavior that left you emotionally drained. You're showing them, not telling them, that they don't get to have your warmth if they're bringing coldness. They don't get your heart if they're acting with indifference. When you avoid someone emotionally, what you're really doing is choosing yourself. You're stepping back from the emotional imbalance and letting your absence speak where your words have been ignored. You're teaching through action, not argument. You're drawing a line in the sand that says, I'm not available for this version of you. And that message is often far more powerful than anything you could say directly. Because now they're not responding to your words, they're reacting to your shift. They're forced to consider what changed, why it changed, and what they're willing to do about it. When you create emotional disconnection, you create space. And space is what activates awareness. Most people don't fully understand what they have until they feel its absence. As long as you are consistently emotionally present, always checking in, always validating, always extending yourself, that presence becomes part of the background noise. It's comforting, yes, but it's also taken for granted. The more available you are emotionally, the more he assumes you always will be. But when you step back, when you stop feeding the connection with your energy, there's an undeniable shift. That shift creates questions, and those questions are what spark pursuit. We tend to believe that closeness is what holds relationships together. And while connection is essential, constant closeness can lead to emotional complacency. Without space, there's no time to miss someone. There's no contrast. There's no moment of what happened. Where is she emotionally? Why does this feel different now? And those are the very questions that stir something. When he senses your emotional distance, not in a dramatic, confrontational way, but in a subtle, grounded way, it disrupts his expectations. The rhythm he relied on is suddenly offbeat. You're not reaching out like you used to. You're not responding with the same warmth. You're not initiating conversation or diving deep into emotions the way you once did. That kind of emotional shift doesn't go unnoticed, even if he doesn't acknowledge it right away. It plants a seed, and that seed begins to grow into curiosity, maybe even discomfort, because when you're no longer there to fill the emotional gaps, he's left to feel the weight of his own detachment. Suddenly, he can't lean on the idea that you'll always be there waiting. He has to consider why things feel different and what role he played in that shift. And that's when the pursuit begins. Not because you begged for it, but because your absence created a space where he had to feel your value, not just observe it. Emotional distance isn't silence for the sake of silence. It's not about withholding to gain power. It's about giving the other person the opportunity to step forward without your prompting. You're no longer steering the connection. You're no longer managing both your emotions and his. You've stepped out of the emotional driver's seat and allowed things to unfold naturally. And in doing so, you allow him to experience what it feels like to not have your emotional availability on demand. That gap between presence and absence is where everything starts to shift. It's where he starts to remember the little things, how you made him feel, how you supported him, how you brought peace into his life. These things are easy to overlook when they're always there, but when they're gone, he has to reckon with what's missing. He begins to replay moments, examine his behavior, and feel the void your emotional presence used to fill. And in that reflection, desire is reborn, not because you pushed for it, but because you stopped pushing altogether. This doesn't happen instantly. There might be confusion at first. He might pull back further, unsure of how to interpret your emotional shift. But if he truly valued you, that space won't sit comfortably with him for long. He'll start to feel the imbalance. He'll sense that something important is slipping through his fingers, and that discomfort becomes the very fuel that drives him to re-engage. He begins to lean in. He asks questions. He starts paying attention to the details he used to overlook. The things you had to ask for before, his time, his effort, his vulnerability, suddenly become his way of trying to bridge the gap, because now he's chasing clarity. He's chasing reassurance. He's chasing the connection you used to give so freely. And it's in this pursuit that the dynamic finally shifts. You're no longer the one holding everything together emotionally. You've created room for him to take responsibility for the connection. And that responsibility is what transforms interest into investment. Without the emotional disconnection, there's no interruption in the pattern. He keeps receiving, you keep giving, nothing changes. But when you step back, when you disconnect with intention and self-respect, it forces him to confront the reality of what he stands to lose. That confrontation can be uncomfortable, but it's often exactly what's needed to bring someone back with greater clarity, deeper effort, and a renewed desire to make it work. One of the most misunderstood dynamics in relationships is the belief that constant emotional presence equals loyalty or love. While it comes from a good place, the desire to support, connect, be reliable, it can often backfire when it's given unconditionally to someone who hasn't shown the same level of commitment. Emotional availability is a beautiful thing when it's mutual, but when it's one-sided, it turns into emotional overcompensation. You begin to do the work of both people, carrying the emotional weight of the relationship in hopes that your consistency will inspire theirs. But what ends up happening is you condition the other person to believe they can show up however they like and still have access to your heart. When you're always the one checking in, initiating deep conversations, offering understanding, and making emotional room for someone who isn't doing the same, you set a precedent. That precedent tells them that they don't need to contribute emotionally to keep the connection alive. They get the benefits of your warmth, your depth, your empathy, and your care without having to meet you there. And slowly, without even realizing it, you find yourself in a situation where your emotional energy is keeping the relationship afloat. You become the anchor, the rescuer, the one who never lets the emotional thread snap, and they become the one who just shows up whenever they feel like it, knowing the emotional safety net is always there. This imbalance becomes more dangerous the longer it goes unnoticed, because the more they get used to receiving without giving, the less motivated they feel to shift the dynamic. If there are no consequences to their emotional distance, they won't feel a reason to close that gap. That's where emotional avoidance becomes necessary, not as punishment, but as realignment. You can't force someone to invest emotionally, but you can stop enabling emotional laziness. You can stop creating a space where they're reaping all the rewards without doing any of the work. By stepping back emotionally, you invite clarity. You create a space where their role in the relationship, or lack of one, becomes undeniable. The discomfort they feel in your emotional absence is revealing. It exposes how much effort they've really been making. It forces them to see how little they've had to do to maintain access to your emotional world. And if there was genuine interest or care beneath their inconsistent actions, this distance will surface it. It will stir something in them because now the emotional comfort they took for granted is no longer a given. They'll begin to recognize that they never truly had you. They just had your effort. And effort can stop, energy can shift, access can be revoked. This creates a powerful pause, one where you're no longer filling in the blanks, carrying both sides of the connection, or trying to decode mixed signals. You're silent, not out of spite, but out of self-worth. You've stopped trying to emotionally rescue someone who isn't even reaching for your hand. And that space you've created, it gives them the room to decide. Do they miss you, or do they miss the attention? Are they ready to invest, or were they just comfortable being passively adored? These are questions they can only answer in your absence, not in your presence. And while they're sitting with that space, you're doing something even more important. You're reconnecting with your emotional standards. You're remembering what it feels like to not constantly reach, to not constantly prove your worth through emotional labor. You're building emotional resilience, the kind that refuses to be drained by someone who hasn't earned your vulnerability. You're no longer reacting to their inconsistency. You're observing it. And that shift in posture is everything, because now the emotional dance is no longer choreographed by their rhythms. It's set by your values, your pace, your clarity. This isn't about making them chase you. It's about making sure that when they do come back, and if they do, it's not because you kept feeding the connection in their absence. It's because they felt the full weight of losing the emotional energy they once took for granted. And they realize that they want more than just the benefit of your presence. They want to show up fully because they finally understand what your presence means. There's something incredibly powerful about emotional discipline, the ability to feel deeply, but choose wisely when and how you express that depth. When you're drawn to someone, it's easy to let your emotions lead. You want to share, connect, open up, be vulnerable. And in many ways, that willingness to be emotionally available is a strength. But when it's offered too freely, especially in the early stages of a relationship or when the dynamic is unbalanced, it can be misinterpreted. It can come across not as strength, but as desperation, not as generosity, but as a lack of boundaries. And in the worst case, it sends the message that you're emotionally dependent on their presence, even if they're not giving you much to work with. This is why emotional restraint is so crucial, not to suppress your feelings, but to protect your power. Because the moment you begin handing over your emotions to someone who hasn't earned them, you shift the dynamic in a way that's hard to recover from. You go from being someone they're curious about, intrigued by, and motivated to pursue, to someone they feel they already have. And the chase dies. Not because they're disinterested, but because the mystery is gone. The emotional intrigue evaporates. They no longer feel like they need to win you over. They know your feelings, they feel your availability, and they start to coast. But when you withhold that emotional availability, not out of fear or manipulation, but from a place of self-respect, you retain something they can't quite grasp. You remain emotionally grounded. You're not reacting to every message, not flooding them with feelings, not eagerly validating them before they've shown you any depth of their own. And that creates space for them to wonder how you feel, space for them to question whether they've truly connected with you. That uncertainty, that emotional gap becomes the fuel that reignites curiosity. It draws them in, not because you're withholding love, but because you're not wasting it on someone who hasn't invested yet. People naturally value what they have to earn. This is true in every area of life, and relationships are no different. When someone feels they have access to your heart without effort, they subconsciously lower its value. Not because you're not valuable, but because the human brain is wired to associate worth with scarcity and effort. If you're constantly available, constantly reassuring, constantly giving, they don't have to work for your emotional presence. and what requires no effort begins to feel replaceable. But the moment you stop emotionally overextending, everything changes. You're no longer the constant in their life. You become a variable, an unknown, and people chase the unknown far more than they hold on to what feels guaranteed. Emotional distance, when done from a place of confidence, becomes magnetic. It communicates that you are in control of your emotions, that you're not waiting around for their approval, and that your emotional life doesn't revolve around their presence. That kind of energy is rare, and it's deeply attractive because it suggests that you have standards, that your love is intentional, that your vulnerability has to be earned, not assumed. It makes them want to understand you, to step up, to close the emotional gap that you've opened by stepping back. And that pursuit is far more meaningful than any attention you could have begged for. This kind of emotional restraint also gives you clarity. It allows you to observe, not just react, to see how they behave without your emotional input constantly guiding them. Do they reach out when you're not feeding the connection? Do they make an effort to connect when you're not leading everything? Do they actually care about what you're feeling, or do they only show up when your attention begins to fade? These are the questions that only space can answer, because as long as you're emotionally available no matter what, you'll never really know where they stand. You'll be carrying both sides of the relationship and mistaking your own effort for mutual connection. Pulling back emotionally isn't weakness, it's strength. It's the ability to sit in discomfort, to allow silence to speak, and to trust that if someone truly values you, they'll come forward. Not because you pushed, but because you let go. Because you allowed them to feel the space your absence creates. And that absence, when they feel it fully, becomes the catalyst for real clarity on their end. It forces them to ask themselves what they're willing to do to bring your emotional presence back into their life. And if the answer is nothing, then you've already protected your peace by stepping away. But if the answer is something, if they start reaching out, leaning in, making an effort, then it wasn't your words that made the difference. It was your emotional silence, your refusal to chase, your choice to lead with quiet strength instead of loud attachment.